Our webinar today will focus on a variety of challenges which ministers face in pastoral ministry. The panel discussion you are about to hear was recorded this summer at General Assembly and was moderated by David Haney. Only a few hours after this panel was taped, David was elected the moderator of the 86th General Assembly, an honor that his father had also received 40 years earlier. Then, as you know, only 2 months later, our Lord called David home to his eternal rest at the age of 56. We continue to miss deeply David's leadership and his passion for the care of ministers. As you listen to David interviewing pastors Stephen O'Herrick, Eric Hausler, and John Van Meerbeck, please note that you will be able to pose your own questions to our panel at any time during the panel discussion by clicking on the question area to the right of your screen. At the end of the panel discussion, Stephen, Eric, and John will be joining me by telephone, and we will attempt to answer live as many of your questions as we can. Please also note that we will be giving out 4 $50 gift certificates to the Christian publisher of your choice to randomly selected participants on today's webinar. To enter your name for this drawing, we have just opened the question feature. Please click on Ask a Question. You can simply sign in as a guest, then enter your name and type the word drawing as your question. I will announce the first of our, quote, providential winners, unquote, in about 20 minutes, and the other 3 at the end of the panel discussion. Well, with those details out of the way, let's join David, Stephen, Eric, and John.
On behalf of the Committee on Ministerial Care, welcome. I am David Haney, Director of the Committee on Ministerial Care. Our webinar today explores some of the challenges which face ministers in their pastoral ministry and which particularly might perplex those of you who are still in the earlier phases of your work. In preparation for this webinar, we have surveyed a number of men in the first decade of ministry and asked them for questions they would pose to a panel of more experienced ministers. I believe, however, that many of the areas that we'll explore today have application to men at all phases of their ministry. I am joined by 3 OPC ministers who have a combined 75 years of pastoral ministry. The first is Stephen O'Herrick, pastor of Reformation OPC in Oviedo, Florida. Our second panelist is Eric Hausler, pastor of Christ the King in Naples, Florida. And our third panelist is John Van Meerbeck, pastor of Living Hope Presbyterian Church in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Welcome, gentlemen. These are questions that have been posed by young ministers, and I'll begin with this. The biggest surprise in my first year of ministry as a solo pastor in a small church was the amount of solitude that characterized ordinary work weeks. I had envisioned pastoral ministry as involving more constant relational interaction, but I have found that FaceTime with church people tends to come in shorter, intense bursts, and I have struggled to use long hours in the study to their best effect. How do you make the best use of alone time, and what strategies work well for increasing FaceTime with the sheep during the week? Brothers, those questions have a lot of background to them. What has been your experience? Let me start with you, Stephen.
Sure. Yeah, I think there are a couple things in the comment, the question to begin with, in terms of the intensity of the relationships that you experience, but also the brevity of them. So I think that was surprising to me, and I don't actually think I realized it until probably more like 10 years into ministry. Just the sort of effect that had on your interactions with the sheep, and the emotional interaction that it has with your own heart, how you process those things. And so if you're in a congregation that's willing to be open with you and have you there in important times, then you're going to have, some pretty intense experiences, but then you'll be gone. And so if there's a death in the family, the whole family's together for a lot of this. you're there in short bursts, and so I think adjusting to that is important. And part of the question as well was, how do you structure the rest of the week? And I think structure is really important. Just being mindful that you have to structure it so that you stay on track each day. You get a little more sermon work done each day. Put in your time in the study, but also make sure you're putting your time in with the visits. And that's just something you have to grow into and be intentional about to get.
Yeah. Others?
When I first started out in the ministry, I found out that I could not have an office at home. I was too easily distracted by things, not just the children, but cutting the grass and other things like that. And so we needed to rent an office space. Then the other problem was spending so much time in the study. The question made me think of men like Calvin and Edwards, who were great men, but they spent many, many, many hours in the study. And I learned that I needed to do it in short bursts, like Stephen says, but that every single day I need to schedule people time. It keeps me awake, keeps me alive, keeps me encouraged. Even though sometimes there are burdens in ministry, it mixes things up.
So you scheduled your time personally?
I did, but not too strictly. Yeah.
Yep. Good. How should a young pastor deal with sluggish sheep and fringe members? People who need to be exhorted to greater personal godliness and church involvement with things even like basic church attendance or attending to the means of grace, more intentional use of the gifts and service. How do you encourage them to do that without being too pushy, especially if some of these members are much older than you are, much more perhaps even seasoned in some senses than you? How do you deal with them? Eric?
Yeah, I think it's important to know exactly what's going on before you jump to conclusions with people, because sometimes there's things happening in their lives that you know nothing about, that they might be struggling with depression, or they've got other anxieties or things that have happened in their lives that have led them to distance themselves for a while from the church or from God's people. And so rather than jumping to conclusions and admonishing them, I've found it's good to find a way to get together with them in a non-threatening environment and just encourage them that we've missed you, and how have things been, and is there something that's keeping you from regular church attendance or from getting involved. And I think I've also found, maybe you brothers have found this too, that sometimes people are just waiting to be asked to do something. Yeah. And if finding exactly what a person's interests are. And I've asked people, what would you like to do? How would you like to get involved in a way that you've never been asked? And that often opens a door to people saying, well, I've always wanted to see if we could be doing this, or if I could do this. So I found that helpful.
This question shifts just a little bit in a different direction. But what part does personal evangelism with strangers play in your regular pastoral practice? And how would you recommend a young man who's in the ministry incorporate that into his practices, especially when it's early on?
In the earlier part of my ministry, I went door to door for a long time without much to speak for it, but it was good for me. I do sincerely believe that if you are faithful in speaking to those who are still strangers to the faith, that the Lord will somehow inevitably bless that effort. But I find that cold calls are not nearly as effective as developing and cultivating relationships. And so when I came to Gettysburg, for example, I got busy joining groups in school in the town. So we had parents groups for the sports teams. I joined Rotary Club, and just recently, believe it or not, I joined a poetry writing class, which actually meets in an art gallery. A lot of young people who really don't have much experience in the church, but welcome me, and that's a great start.
One of the things I always make sure that I've got a calling card with me, or a church invitation cards. We got little "you're invited" cards to our church, and I guess I've always had the gift of gab and talking to strangers. Yeah. You can ask my siblings. Ever since I was a kid, I'm always the one willing to talk to a stranger. And I always look for a hook whenever I'm standing in a grocery line or in at a cash register in another store or wherever I am, the gas station. I look for some kind of a hook for a conversation starter with somebody, because you never know who God's going to bring across your path and what that might lead to, and start a conversation with them. So I don't do door to door, but I do lots of grocery store conversations with people because I enjoy talking to people, and I've handed out lots of church invitations that way, and the Lord has brought a lot of people into our lives that way. So.
And one of the nice things about being a pastor as it intersects with evangelism is if you just start talking to people out in public and then a topic comes up, what do you do?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a natural in. I mean, some people shut you down at that point, but a lot of times you'll get some story of how they've been hurt by the church or how they've been blessed by the church, or they'll make some comment. It's just it's a very natural way to.
I usually am a little more cloaked. I'll say I have a flock of sheep and I tend a vineyard. And like, really, a vineyard? Yeah. So I do. Then I get to explain what that means, but it kind of draws them in before you get the door shut on the pastor thing, because I've had that happen a lot, where like deer in the headlights and they turn away. And
very different question. How do you stay fresh spiritually in your walk with Christ and avoid that temptation to begin living as just a professional Christian?
I have had stages throughout, and so I'm just coming up on 20 years, and I definitely have seen seasons where that's been more of a struggle, which inevitably have, by God's grace, yielded to seasons, I think, of greater spiritual tenderness than I'd had before, and leaning on the Lord more personally and more fully than I had before. So I'm grateful for that. That's the work of the Holy Spirit. It is a challenge, but I guess one of the things that I think I figured out a little bit along the way is with my sermon preparation, the amount of heart engagement I have with what's really going on in the text. What is the Lord saying? And as my burden increased to share that with other people, it first became a matter of sharing it with myself and figuring out we have a beautiful Word of God that He's given to us. So as you really begin to plunge into that, you don't even have to deliver that sermon, and you've been, richly blessed by that if you're doing your work in a certain way, I think. So I found that helpful, in addition, of course, to the regular disciplines of prayer and regular reading. But I think there are ways in your ministry that you can stay sensitive.
I recall my dad saying he had to often preach to himself before he could preach to the congregation.
Don't we all?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Others?
There's an article, I think it's B.B. Warfield who wrote that, on Thoughts to Seminary Students, theological students, about studying devotionally, that when you're doing your sermon preparation, he was writing to seminary students that, what a privilege that you have to handle, even in the parsing of words, these words that God has used to bring people to saving faith for centuries. What a privilege that you get to do this. And for pastors, that we get paid to do that we get paid to spend time studying these passages of Scripture that have changed people's lives. And so I think studying devotionally with a thankful heart, and just recognizing the great blessing it is, and asking God as you're studying to be teaching you and encouraging you and preparing you, and what more can I see, Lord, in this?
Good.
This questioner makes this remark first. He said, I should always weigh my words before I speak as a believer. And he cites Matthew 12. But he also says, so shame on me for not developing well in that area in my first 35 years of my life. He says, but now as a minister of the gospel, my words often carry more weight in the hearts and minds of God's people, particularly to those I've been called to shepherd. On my best days, I have a sober sense of this, and I'm very slow to speak and make sure I'm in tune with the occasion in which I'm speaking, so that my words offer real grace and build others up. But I still need quite a bit of growth in this area. How have you disciplined yourself to be more careful in these areas?
By making a lot of mistakes.
I always say the best ministry I've done is when my mouth is shut. And the number, I think, of hospital visits in particular, when people are suffering, when you just sit with them and cry with them and don't offer platitudes or quick answers. So I think a willingness, and I know there's a bit of hypocrisy as I say this, because if you ask anyone in my household how much I talk, it's a little bit. But I think a willingness to just be quiet, to listen to others. As James says, slow to speak, quick to listen. And I think that that will help you pick better words if you must pick many at all. I've found that useful, but still, I saw some chuckling over here. It may be because we're all still working on that. It's difficult as you hear this question to think, how do we ever get quite to that place? But yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to say I've never had that problem, but but I think you were alluding to this earlier, Eric, with respect to people who don't feel like they're plugged in quite the way you might want them to be. And the best way, I'm not setting myself up as an example of this, but the best way to minister to that is by asking questions, clarifying questions, but really saying to your people, tell me your story in so many words, because it's not going to be the first pastoral visit, and it might not be until after the fifth or sixth pastoral visit that you've earned their trust, and that they want to open their hearts to you, that you care, their story, and that you relate to it. You want the gospel to bear on it.
I'm sure these brothers too have had a lot of people who said, I remember you told me one time. It's like, I did. It just reminds me to be very careful with what I say and make sure that it's encouraging, even in times when you need to admonish somebody or point something out, that you're encouraging.
Good. That you remind me of, you talked about when you have to confront someone. Even then, there's a unique opportunity for a pastor to say something like, "Oh, you don't mean that," or "Let me see if I understand what you're saying," or some such thing. There are ways to not be threatened by being confronted or having to confront.
But prior to ministry, I didn't realize how hard it would be to focus my attention on the ministry of word and prayer that are all central to my calling. I continually find even the good but lesser things screaming for my attention in such a way that I'm regularly tempted to spend my time doing something other than preparing to preach or teach or counsel or in prayer. This gentleman says, if I could talk to my preordained self, I would say, prepare your mind for action and be sober-minded. Make a prayerful commitment now to devote the bulk of your time and the best of your time in studying the word and in prayer for the flock, and establishing a way to keep yourself accountable to those things. But he still struggles with that ability to have that focus. What have you found helpful in providing that focus?
I'll say just some of the basics about even just your health, making sure you get a good night's rest, and that you're eating in a healthy way, and that you're getting your heart beat up, so that the best chunk of yourself. When do you study best? When do you have the best attention to prayer and the word? Better than anybody, and it's not the same for everybody. For me, I'm a very early morning person. If I get a good night's rest and have a really good cup of coffee in the morning, that I've got a great morning of study. But I have to have a really good night's rest, and planning ahead the night before that tomorrow I'm going to spend the whole morning studying, so that I get up and have a good protein breakfast, had a good night's rest. That I guess just for me, it's knowing when I do my best work. I do not do my best work late in the afternoon. By late in the afternoon, I'm ready to get up from my desk and do something else. So that's when I go see people or visit people. And
I suspect that, I know it's person relative, but I suspect that what Eric just said is true for a lot of us. I know it is for me as well. And I think a lot of pastors have the habit of setting the mornings aside for their study, for prayer, and the afternoons for visitation, evenings. I know that works for me. I also do not do my best focused work in the study in the afternoon. That's the time I love to be out with people, and that it just knowing your body, knowing your habits, how you function, how your mind works.
Prior to ministry, I didn't expect my suffering with Christ to take place in the study. While I labored over the word in prayer, I thought more in terms of persecution and less in terms of hermeneutics and homiletics. So I didn't have a mindset prepared to suffer with and for Christ as I wrestled with biblical texts and as they wrestled with me. So I unintentionally set my hopes on a day when I would no longer suffer from uncertainty in exegesis, a sense of competence in homiletics, and the suffering of keeping my struggles to myself and not burdening the family with them. Then he says that discovering that part of my calling is to suffer in the study and in the pulpit has been greatly helpful to me, so that I'm not warring or hoping against it, but seeing it as a valuable part of my fellowship with Christ in his service. I still suffer, but with more peace, and I hope faithfulness. Do any of you want to share how you have gone through that, or if you have gone through that, and in what sense what do you have learned in terms of coping with some of those frustrations?
I don't mind sharing a little bit about a period in my ministry where I fell into a deep depression. And I stepped out of the ministry for close to 3 years. And during that 3 years, I gradually made my way back into the ministry. But there was one difference. I'm not saying this is everything, but this is one that made a big difference in my life and still does. That when you're going after a text, you can be tempted to be professional about it and just look at the mechanics of it. But sometimes you have to break away from what you are exegeting and step back and ask yourself about the character of God and go deep there and ask what this says about, and be able to expound that to your congregation with passion as you preach it to yourself, as you said.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. And I think I've suffered more in the pulpit than the study. I've probably suffered from too much confidence that I had the text and I had the sermon. And then in the preaching, you discover you might not have had either. So that's suffering for Christ in a particular way. But I mean, I appreciate the sensitivity of the author of that question and how they're going about it, and what John has said just about you have to sit with it.
Yeah.
Anything more you'd like to say about just that topic of working through times of discouragement? I mean, John, you mentioned 3 years of times of discouragement and depression, but working through that, what you found helpful to you?
Yeah, I'm not sure the best way to do this, but it seems to me that there are people in your congregation who know you and know life well enough to be patient with you during those times and to cry with you, pray with you, and just simply wait on you to go through. Somebody asked me one time, what happens if we come into the office and find you under the desk crying? And I had no hesitation. I said, get under the desk with them and pray, pray.
I would say I found it so important to have a Barnabas in my life.
Yeah.
Usually an older man I've had two really, really wonderful Barnabases in different places I've been, that even if I felt like I did terrible, they would say, oh, it's so good to hear the word of God today. But just having someone that is encouraging and Acts 11 says that he encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their heart. To have someone like that is an encourager, I really need that. I haven't found one where I am now, but I have a couple long distance. Mm-hmm. The other thing, I had a really when I thought about that question, I had a discouraging lunch appointment a couple weeks ago, and just one of those where you feel, everything they say is like, thank you. And it's just kind of backhanded. It's not directly at you. And I thought, I'm done with this lunch appointment. And so my wife is the chaplain administrator at the jail. And I called her up and said, can I come down and talk to a couple inmates? I need some encouragement of people who are hungry for hope, because I just felt so discouraged by this. So sometimes for me, just getting out and ministering to people who are needing hope and encouragement, just to take your mind off the discouraging situation, or to see the Spirit at work in someone's life in a way that gives you encouragement. So for me, doing some hands-on ministry will bring me out of a discouraging situation.
I made a mistake for a lot of years, and that was thinking that I couldn't burden people in my congregation with my discouragements, that I could only outsource that to other colleagues or family or what have you. And I think that was a real mistake, to not let people in my church in on things that, just we go through in life and the discouraging seasons of things. At a certain point, I stopped caring enough to protect them, to share with them, and really saw fruit from that. And I think there are people in our congregations, if we're so blessed by God, who are eager to bear those burdens with us, and may consider it a great honor to have their pastor do that. And I do think you have to be cautious. You're still their shepherd, and you don't want to compromise that relationship. But I do think that you can really honor others by letting them take care of you at times, as long as you don't lean too, in the wrong ways upon them, I guess. But I think that's a mistake I made for a lot of years, not being open to that.
Back to our studio. We will continue with our panel in just a moment, but I would like to announce the first of our viewers today who will receive a $50 gift certificate to help build his library. And our winner is Andrew Canavan. Congratulations, Andrew. We have received several questions from viewers for our panelists, and we will answer as many of those as we can in about 20 minutes. So let's return to the second half of our panel discussion.
Next question comes from a different perspective, somebody who's arriving new at a new church to minister. And he said, sometimes you encounter things that don't seem right when you first arrive. It might be a practice concerning worship, how you receive new members. It's not a clear violation of our book of church order, but it just doesn't seem wise, or it doesn't seem helpful. How do you know when to make a change or when to just let it go?
The first congregation I served, which your father served years before I did as well for a time, and this wasn't your father's fault, I'm confident, but when I got there, it was my first charge, and I love this congregation. They were doing a bunch of things really badly, though. I mean, there were some flat out unconstitutional things, people voting at session meetings that weren't session members. I mean, so there were some things going on, and I remember just thinking, I've heard it said, don't do anything, don't make any changes for the first year, just put your head down, do ministry. But some of these things have got to change, we're going to get found out. But I still was very cautious about that. I still was new in town, and I just really tried to look at the things that I thought, if this isn't deeply dishonoring to the Lord, we can work on this patiently, and other things maybe that needed more direct address. But your congregation has got to get the sense that you are humble about whatever changes you're proposing, and that you didn't come as the new sheriff in town, trying to have your way with things, but that you really feel like these are things we ought to consider changing. And then, of course, to the extent that you can, get your session totally on board with this. Try to build consensus about what things we might change, and that's, Lord blessed in that area. I was able to get my fellow elders on board with some different things, but I was still very cautious the first few years, really. It was a long established church. There were a lot of reasons not to come in and just start. I was younger by 50 years than most people in the church. So a lot of reasons for that, but I think caution is good. And then there's some things you just look at and say, we need to do this sooner than later, I think.
Stephen, that is it ever really good to advise anybody? It sounds like you were saying no, that they shouldn't make any changes the first year, because actually you kind of need to test the waters, don't you? Yeah. And you also don't want to lend the impression that you're not interested in making any changes, that you want to go with the status quo. Of course, you have to choose those wisely, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think part of that would be preventative and coming up with lots of questions beforehand, before
Yeah.
taking a call, that how do you do this, and what's the way you do this, and make sure that some of these areas are already covered, that you're coming into this, and asking them ahead of time, would you be open to changing that if
Right.
I think those are some important things
Mhm.
too.
This young pastor says, I have a hard time delegating tasks and getting people to really own a task or do an excellent job. I feel like I often have to redo the whole thing. How do you delegate well?
Having had several interns recently, walking alongside them and showing them how I do it several times, and then giving them an opportunity to plan something or do something, and then tell them we're going to review it before we implement it. Or say planning a worship service, I'm delegating a worship service, or delegating the planning of an event for the church, a luncheon or something, to the women of the church, but making sure that you let them know what you want done. And sometimes you just have to let them go with it and see what happens.
I would want to know if the questioner has a difficult time delegating, for what reason. Is it a control thing, or it probably isn't, but is he terribly shy or afraid to ask for people to do things? Those things might be answered and helpful there.
Let's move a little different direction then. We've been grieved to see many young people leave Reformed theology or even the Christian faith altogether when they reach their 20s. What are some effective ways you found for imparting our faith to our youth before they leave for college?
I'm grateful to say in the two congregations I've pastored, by God's grace, I have not had to see a lot of that. I've had I guess what I'd call a couple close calls where I thought I saw someone either moving entirely away from the faith altogether, or just really straying in some other ways, doctrinally or otherwise. But for the most part, God's been really generous in these couple of churches, and I do think family. One thing I've noticed is families that make a habit of morning and evening worship attendance. There's a difference that I see in terms of how the kids grow up really imbibing this. I think it makes it different for them. We could talk about catechesis and Sunday school and keeping them in the worship service, not doing children's church, whatever. I mean, there are different things you can look at to try to grow them up that way. But I just think in terms of one anecdotal thing I've observed is, families that bring their kids morning and evening, those kids grow up with a certain understanding of the importance of the Lord and his worship. And our family devotes so much of this one day each week. I think that makes a real impression upon them. No method is going to ensure an outcome, obviously, but I think those are helpful things the Lord is pleased to bless.
I always think, I've been thinking over this a lot lately. We had a young man not too long ago who got himself in a lot of trouble over a period of time. There was just one thing after another, and it was becoming alarming and disturbing. It hadn't risen to the level of discipline just yet. And but I was talking in those terms with the session when one of the other pastors said to me, I'd rather do it this way. I'd rather we put our arms around our little brother and tell him that we can help him. And so what I've been learning lately through things like that is that our ministry is too often outcome based rather than grace based or grace filled. It's hard to quantify that. It's hard to measure it. It's hard to be an expert in it. But the more we experience and exercise and express our love, the less we have to worry about how people are going to turn out. And prayer goes a long way to help that.
I think I found too, like in the 15 years that I was at Redeemer Church in Ada, we had a commitment to taking kids on mission trips, either local in the community or to, like we went to the Appalachian Mountains, we went overseas, a number of places, a lot of times to Haiti, and the young people that were involved in hands-on service where they see the gospel at work in lives of people, particularly people less fortunate than them, where they see lives being changed and the joy of the gospel in another culture. Those kids today are young people more involved and more on, involved in their churches, on fire for the Lord. And I think there's fruit from that.
Now I'm going to change to another subject that a few questions came in that were very similar thread. So I'll try to package them a bit together. And they have to do with a subject that typically glazes over pastors, sometimes of all ages. And that has to do with finances. Yeah. I think you know what might be coming. It's on the table now. And these are men who are struggling on the early end of their careers with those financial issues. They might be the result of perhaps student debt. They might be perhaps in the area of a call that is very light in terms of compensation. And so they're facing these struggles. They don't feel they have had much training in this area. How would you encourage those young men as they come into ministry, how to get the help they need?
Get some basic pointers on budgeting. Our denomination has some excellent resources. We have some excellent deacons. There are ways just to figure out how to do a basic budget. And before I accepted my first call, and I knew it was going to be a very small package. They eliminated the words "free from worldly care," at the Presbyterian level, because he's going to have all kinds of worldly care. They didn't insert those words, I don't think, but I can't remember for sure. And I remember just sitting down and figuring out, can we possibly cover expenses? And, and we saw a way, and at the same time paying off, we didn't have a lot of debt from school, but we had some. So just to account all of that in and to live frugally, but, the calling that we have and the sort of pay scale that we're looking at in our line of work, you can't just wipe away large amounts of debt very easily. And so you have to be very realistic and conscious of that before taking on that debt. And then in whatever position you're in, just looking and saying, am I making more than I'm spending at this point? A very basic thing. And figuring out how to do a budget. I think those are, I know that may seem simplistic because life's expensive, but in some ways it kind of comes down to some of those basics, I think.
Committee on Ministerial Care continues to try to develop resources for those types of situations. It is an area where we know men are struggling. I think one area I would hope that we have is as a man finds himself in those circumstances, certainly to be working with his session. To try to keep those things to yourself can enter a boiling point internally, and I think it's helpful to have at least the help of your session. Now I'll talk a little bit about another subject, and that would be friendship. Being in the ministry often can be a lonely place because of the nature of your work and what you are aware of. Can be a difficult place not only for you, but it also can be for your spouse in terms of developing friendships. In what ways have you found to be beneficial to help fill those needs for deep friendships? Somebody who really can walk alongside of you, to be the Barnabas, to be the one to encourage you. Where can you find those relationships?
I've always found, when I've moved to a new place, that I make it a matter of prayer that the Lord would provide for me a friend that, and usually that friend is outside of the congregation, so that I've got somebody that I can get together with that's not going to have all the church issues, at the same time. A Christian brother of another church, evangelical, reformed, maybe, but just that I can feel more like my guard is down as far as things that are going on at the church. I don't have to talk about that. Someone who's got similar interests. I have a friend in our neighborhood who's a Christian. They go to a different church, and we met swimming laps, and he started coming to our men's breakfast now. But he's one that I feel like I can just to get away from the pressures of ministry and be encouraged and have some fun together, doing, swimming laps or taking a walk on the beach. And those are really, really important relationships, I think, to have.
I have one ministerial colleague in particular who I just know I can call anytime. And I do find friendships with other pastors help address, I think one contributing factor for pastors feeling lonely is the kinds of experiences we have can be kind of unique and hard to share with others. And so being able to talk to another pastor who's also had the weighty things, the big experiences with families in times of crisis and such. So I have one guy in particular that I can just lean on for anything, and he'll drive a distance and meet me somewhere. And then I've got another friend that I go play pool with, and we don't talk about anything heavy. We talk about massing, and we talk about, so I think having a little bit of a mixture of playful friendships and then people you can just sort of, collapse into their arms if you need to. So.
And I know it probably is the wrong question for you, but what about your wives? I mean, how do they find those friendships that they're longing for? Any advice?
That's really important to make sure that she's free to find someone in your community, because that can be a very lonely place for a pastor's wife. Make that a matter of prayer, and pray God will be able to answer that. He's faithful to do that.
It is and can be a lonely a place to be. I don't want to say position to be in. My wife is actually pretty good at making friends and acquaintances. She plays a lot of golf and has grandchildren, but actually when she heard about the Committee on Ministerial Care, she did ask me, when are they going to ask the pastor's wives some questions? And you know what? I was convicted by that because it didn't even occur to me.
Just going to wrap up probably with this last question from a minister who is new to ministry. And he's basically asking the question, there's a host of challenges, but how should I be wise before I've actually been able to be growing in wisdom? In other words, I'm young. I haven't had the experiences yet. How do I gain that wisdom to be able to counsel well, to be able to navigate difficult circumstances? How can I gain that wisdom, you might say, before I have the years of wisdom?
So in my first pastorate, I mentioned we had an older congregation. I believe it was in the first year of my pastorate. The very first funeral I did was for a dear woman in our church who died and left her husband a widower. And then the very first wedding I did, he got remarried. And I sat down with him and his fiancée, and they were both in their 70s. And they'd both been married and lost spouses before to death. And we sat down, and I was going to do premarital counseling with them. And I was 26, I think, at the time. And combined, they had twice as much marriage experience, more than that, than I had been alive. And I said, well, let me tell you the secret to a happy marriage. I read some scriptures. I tried to stick really close to the text because I was painfully aware I didn't have a lot of practical stuff to offer them. So here's what I know God's word says about marriage. Let me remind you of some things, if you'll be so kind as to listen for a bit. And I think that's what I really tried to do with this wonderful congregation. They were all, so many of them seasoned Christians, walked with the Lord for so many decades, and I was still new to everything, really. And so if they knew I was going to try to just speak to them as much straight from the word as possible, then they wouldn't have complaints with that, and I wouldn't presume to impart to them my vast experience.
I think a lot of us come out of seminary with a lot of knowledge, but not necessarily wisdom. That to recognize as a young pastor, I've got a great toolbox that I've been given from seminary of all these different subjects, but applying all that to life is going to take some time. And so not going into a conversation, a counseling session, a ministry, thinking you know everything, you know all the answers, or you know how to apply this, but or that you know it all. I think it's a lot of guys get out of seminary and they act like they know everything. I've got my degree. I've been to seminary. I know everything. I'm going to fix everything.
Fake it till you make it, huh?
But just approaching things humbly and saying, asking people to pray that God will give you wisdom. I think a humble pastor, who's humble, gifted pastor, is going to go a lot farther than someone who appears like they know it all and they're telling everybody what to do. So if I could go back and undo some things in my own life, I think that would be key. But I've seen that in others.
Sometimes it's hard to get grounded after seminary, after all that time of intensive study. It's maybe it's good to read things outside of your area of expertise, not even having to do with the ministry, and asking for a lot of help and wisdom. And we go to conferences and we read books, and those things do help us.
Yeah, I remember a lady said to me, as I went off to seminary, I'd been in a pre-seminary internship, and she said, "I just pray that you don't come back a book." And I remembered that all through school, and as I came back to the same church, that I wouldn't come back with just all this head knowledge like I know everything.
Well, thank you, men. This has been helpful, I hope, for many as they will view this webinar. Thank you much, Stephen, Eric, John,
Thank you
for your time today. May God bless your ministries as you continue to serve him.
Thank you to our three panelists who have joined me on the telephone to answer some of the questions you have sent in today. We will take a few of the questions which seem to have the widest application, and then I'll announce the three additional winners of the $50 gift certificates. Following that, I'll pose some additional questions as we have time. So first of all, the questions. Perhaps the first one I can address to you, Stephen. Are you there? If you find that the terms of a call are not adequate or not sufficient, what would you suggest how to go about resolving that, or how would you go about seeking to address that in order to encourage a more adequate terms of the call?
I missed one. Were you asking me that, Lendall?
Yeah, I thought I'd start with you, Stephen, if you could.
Yeah. I mean, that can be a delicate process, but I think it's important, first of all, to be willing to decline a call if you really can't responsibly make that work. But before jumping right to that, to try to work with the session, explain to them what your needs are. There may be someone else on your behalf that could help with that if you're more comfortable with that. But you need to take care of your family for sure.
Thank you. Maybe I'll address the next question to you, Eric. You talked briefly about an intern program. Could you go into more details of what you would, how you would regard an effective intern program should include?
So I begin with an orientation. In fact, we just received a new intern who came a week ago Saturday, and I spend better part of the day just giving a history of the church and going over expectations and a number of very practical things about weekly ministry, what's going on. I try to involve our interns in as many hands-on kinds of ministry as possible so that they get a variety of experiences. I think the way for a young man, as we all know, the way to become a better preacher is to have practice preaching and teaching. So I desire to see interns grow in their confidence to preach. And I think with the interns we've had, the last 2 years particularly, both of them have grown significantly because almost every Sunday they preach. We have morning and evening service. And so I would typically give them the evening service 3 Sundays a month and then swap. And they would take a morning, but also giving them opportunities to teach in settings where they might be out of their comfort zone, but they get a chance to boil the message down to a lower level. I do a weekly Bible study at our county jail, and with a group of men sitting around a table. And if you can boil down the gospel and even significantly challenging texts so that a group of guys, and some have never studied the Bible before, if you can break down the gospel and the message of a text so that they can understand it, I think you'll come out after a year of being able to teach anywhere.
Mm.
So giving them opportunities to see at all areas of the life of the church and get involved and practice and plan. And as I mentioned on the presentation, giving them opportunities, walk alongside, and then giving them a chance to do it themselves.
Mm.
It takes a lot of extra time, but I think it's well worth it for the health of the churches in the long run.
Yeah, I really appreciate the things that you've mentioned. I've often thought if I could start my ministry over again, I would like to have a year-long intern ministry. I think it would be very helpful. John, a couple of questions that we have is, I think in response to your gracious comments about a personal struggle that you had experienced in your lifetime, and the question comes, what are ways that you can encourage open, transparent, and redemptive relationships within the church? And it seems to me that the question deals with how can we be open and honest, and that may include some of the struggles that we have.
Yes, I think of this on two levels. One is with respect to our sin, and then or sanctification and growth, and the other level with our own mental health and other issues. So the first one, I'm reminded of a theologian who wrote that the church is just never going to move forward until its people begin to talk about what they're repenting of. So there's an openness and a vulnerability that requires the pastor to at least acknowledge his own struggles, even from the pulpit, without being autobiographical or heavily autobiographical about it, but actually just speaking to what we all struggle with. And then the other is also just to acknowledge the faults of the Bible characters about whom we're preaching. Elijah was a pretty moody fellow, and whenever that comes up, I tell the congregation, well, I don't have that problem, and they seem to know that what I'm actually saying is, well, I kind of do, and maybe you do too. And also, it takes time to through visits to recognize it's going to be quite a while, not just the first or second visit, but quite a while before a congregation member will be able to open up to you about those things, but not without your vulnerability.
Thank you. I might come back to that in just a minute, but I'd like to announce the other winners, the three winners that we have of the $50 gift certificates. One is Jim Hoekstra. Congratulations, Jim. And then the second one is Wayne Veenstra. Congratulations, Wayne. And the third one is John Hartley. So congratulations to you, John. To Jim, Wayne, and John, thank you for participating, and trust that you'll enjoy the gift certificates. If I could return to you just a moment about, to you, John, about that, are there any ways that you would suggest where that kind of openness and communication should be encouraged and developed among colleagues at the presbytery level?
Yeah, I think in the panel, Eric had mentioned fellow ministers and friends outside the church, and I think all of us have that experience through a faithful ministerium of evangelical brothers or such a thing. But it is the responsibility, isn't it, of the presbytery for us to be looking after one another, not checking up on one another or ticking off certain boxes. There are ways that we can do that as well. But actually just coming together to talk about ministry in ways that are more organic, talk about our struggles, giving one another advice rather than bringing proposals and taking actions on them. Now, in our presbytery, the northern part of our presbytery gathers on a monthly basis, and they go through a book. They're going through Ferguson's book on pastoral ministry. We get together to talk and pray at a bookstore where it's comfortable to meet, and we can get a room to ourselves and talk about things we wouldn't necessarily otherwise talk about, what we're up against, maybe even in our own individual churches. But it's one way for us to follow up on one another and the struggles that we're going through, and to check on if there's any progress being made in those struggles.
Thanks. Stephen, let me come back to you. If any of these questions too, if the other men want to chime in, please feel free to do that. But here's a question. How do you minister to a person who very badly wants to be an elder, a ruling elder in the church, but simply isn't qualified? What would you do in that particular situation?
Yeah, I've definitely faced that in the past, and it's a delicate thing when someone really believes that they're called to any office. I mean, you know, we minister in the shadow of a seminary here, so we have a lot of pastoral candidates come through, and then people who aspire to elder or deacon, and so when someone feels that they have this calling, then you need to work carefully with them. You need to be sensitive and listen and look carefully. But if at the end of the day, the session, concludes this person is not called to be an elder, then, and I'm thinking of some things that Eric said during the panel discussion, I think you find how they can contribute. What is it in them that makes them want to be an elder, and play off the best of those impulses to see how they can be a blessing in the body. How can they function well in the body? If it's not that call, then it may be something that shares some things in common. There's lots of ways to encourage people, to shepherd with a lowercase s, to help, and so helping them maybe see, this is actually a much better way for you to be a part of a well-functioning body. So that's going to come up for me. I think it comes up for most pastors within a matter of years of doing ministry, and to try to channel that in a good, positive direction.
Right.
If I could answer that question too, I think it's I've encountered this a number of times, often also with young men who think they're called or who think they're not called, but everybody thinks they should be. But there's something where they feel like they're not called. I like to find time in a private setting to sit down and talk about the distinction between the inward call and the church call, the outward call, that both have to be there. The sense of, I really believe God is calling me to this ministry. And the church saying, we really believe God has equipped you and is calling you to ministry. And both of those have to be there. And if one of them is not, then it's not a recipe for productive, healthy church, because you're going to force someone with guilt. If everybody's saying, yes, 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 you're called, and the guy himself is saying, I don't think I'm called, then he's forced in by guilt. Everybody's saying I'm called, I guess I better. But then when things come up that are challenging, that he runs into problems because he doesn't have that sense of the inner sense of calling, that God is with me. He's called me, and I know he's going to see me through this. On the other side, too, if there's someone who really, really, really believes they're called, and the whole church is saying, no, you're not. I think there's a gentle way of saying that both of those need to be present. And at the moment, God's people don't see that. Maybe there's some things we can work on to see some character changes or some gifts that need to be more developed. if you really believe God has called you, let's pray and work to that end, or to help them see, there's some glaring things here that I really care about you, and I want to see the Lord soften some of these things. I've known someone who used to serve as an elder at a different denomination, and ended up in one of our churches and really believed that God was calling, but nobody nominated. Nobody believed he was fitting for it. And it gave me an opportunity. This is still going on here in Florida, but it's given me an opportunity to talk about what are some ways in which the Lord could soften these rough edges, because there's some rough edges that you don't see.
Thank you very much. Just time for, we'll conclude with this last question, which tends to be which is obviously quite serious, and perhaps any of you or one of you, considering, this is what the question is, considering the rash of pastors committing suicide, where can a minister go when depression, marriage problems, anxiety, and other mental health issues arise?
Well, let me.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, thanks, Lendall. It's a good question. I was kind of hoping something like this might come up, not for my benefit or opportunity, but because we've all been thinking about these things recently. I cannot impress upon my colleagues in the ministry, especially, to understand that mental health is not, strictly speaking, a spiritual problem. What I mean to say is, I'm not saying that spirituality and matters of the heart are not all entwined in that. But I'm concerned that so many who are dealing with mental health issues are not going to mental health professionals who know about things like depression and anxiety and other such matters. There is such a thing as a biological issue in the brain that needs treatment. At the very least, to get a person on an even keel so that he or she can begin to talk about what the issues are, even if they are sin related. But too often we jump to a spiritualizing of the problem rather than going to actual experts who know what they're talking about. I think the article by Jim Barry on addiction sort of touches on that. He shows that as an elder, there's also a certain amount of medical expertise that should be brought to the table and should be welcomed by people like us. We shouldn't be caught behind the eight ball on this subject over which we have little or no expertise at all.
Anything else that either you, Stephen, or Eric would like to add to that?
I would maybe want to just re-emphasize some things that I think John was saying earlier. I agree with what he just said about the medical professionals who can actually address this and look at the chemical side of things. I think leaning on our brothers, I think fellow pastors can sometimes be just in the best place to really bear burdens with us, our elders. And look, we have resolved to go into this ministry to where we want to proclaim Christ and stand for him. And so that's going to be hard work, and we're going to need people to help prop us up in doing that. And so just coming to terms with that, not being ashamed at all of that, we just have to have people that we can lean on. So that's just very important. Every minister, that should just be a foregone conclusion. It's good to reach out for some help. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That's all the time we have for the broadcast today, but thank you, each of you, Stephen and Eric and John. Thank you for sharing your thoughts in the panel discussion that you had with David, and also answering these questions. We appreciate your ministry very much, and we thank you for participating today.